discovered. And you're up.
What's up, Jake?
What's going on, Mark? How you been, man?
Pretty good. Time for another session of therapy, reef therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's nice not to force ourselves to do it every week, because then when we take a week off, like the next week is like, oh man, I have so much to talk about and I can't wait to jump into it.
Yeah, I think, we all listen to different podcasts and on different things other than reef, and it's the ones where they're forced by schedule to always come up with a topic. It gets sometimes weak, because you're pushing it too much, whereas it's sort of like forcing a conversation versus having it occur naturally, right?
Yeah. Speaking of which, I actually just discovered a really good podcast.
Oh yeah?
It's I think it's called Watercolors something. I think it's funny because it sounds like 2 or 3 young staffers at this aquarium store in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And I listened to one that they had a conversation with, I think his name is Bill Backus from A&M Aquatics.
I was supposed to say that name sounds familiar.
And that was a great, saltwater conversation that discussed a lot about, I don't know, just kind of like the current state of things in Hawaii, and the cost of fish right now is all freight and handling fees. It's not even how much the fish costs, it's just how much it costs to get to the consumer. And I also listened to an episode they did on just Apistogrammas, and it was so nerdy, and they did their research beforehand, so they kind of went into the deep end of the pool a little bit. But man, I really appreciated it. So it's kind of rare for me to find some other content producers, creators, who produce content that I really enjoyed. I think it took me all day to digest the one I did with Bill Backus, but man, it's really good. They have a lot of episodes, and I'm looking forward to listening to more.
I got to check that out, because especially when you mentioned, Apistos, I got into them for a little bit for a while there. But
I just got some Apistos last weekend.
Which ones you get?
So Sumer Tiwari, he is a local aquarist who he doesn't do too many different kinds of freshwater fish.
Yeah.
I guess he kind of does. He got wild discus, he has ultums, zebra placos, leopard frog placos, and then a whole suite of small betas and Apistos.
Which leopard frog are one of my all-time favorites.
Yeah, they're pretty cool. So he's bred everything, man. He hasn't bred the discus. I think he's working on spotting the ultums, but he's raised the red whiptail catfish.
Mm-hmm.
He's raised leopard frogs, and he's raised zebra placos. So he came by to drop off 5 locally grown, homemade zebra placos. So I'm up to 8 now, and he also gave me, again, some Apistogramma lulingi that are descendants of some specimens that he personally collected, I believe, in Peru, over 5-6 years ago. So he gave me a pair about 5 years ago that I had for a long time. I think the female died within the last year. Yeah, so he dropped off a couple more pairs.
Nice.
They're like a Collectoritis without any color. They're not something you're gonna have even in the best of form. There's not gonna be a wow photo. They're neat, yeah. And I like the story that they're descendants of Sumer's original stock. So that was pretty cool.
That is really cool.
Yeah.
So today, well, first let's start off talking about, you just dived in a bit on the freshwater side, but tell me something new going on with your plethora of reef tanks.
Everything's doing super good. When I put the brakes on acquiring new stock, I can focus on making my existing collection that much healthier, and following on the initial successes of treating the unidentified pathogen that was occurring in my Euphilia tank.
Mm-hmm.
Just to bring people back up to speed, I introduced some sort of freshly wild torch corals to my Euphilia garden, and then a couple weeks later, slowly, I lost one torch polyp, and then a different torch polyp, and then one Galaxia lost one polyp, and it was it looked so bad. So I reef primered it, and that seems to like burn off the infection initially. And then I kept the torchy frog spawn, so frog spawn with like just a touch of torch in its appearance, and the Galaxia in a hospital tank with a new type of antibiotic. So the initial prescription was for like, I think, a 30-minute or an hour bath, but someone else I talked to was doing overnight dips, just overnight holding.
Whoa.
I literally kept them in the hospital tank with the tiniest 3-5 watt LED light for about 3 weeks, and I just took him out. I just now took him out and put him back around, and so yeah, it's actually really encouraging to make some progress in that department. Yeah, that's where I'm at with the stock.
That's good.
And I picked up some used corals. Man, used corals are the freaking best. So I went to a store that had Merman's Reef in Lakewood, I believe, that had, it's really well known locally for lots of tank trade-ins. And I got a handful of used corals from the tank teardown, including a large colony. Like a 6-inch across colony of Oregon tort. Like, if you're a coral farmer and you know how much you can get per frag, you don't even want to know what I got this colony for. A large colony of, what else did I get? A nice, like tank-grown plating lithophyllon, but with really fleshy tentacles. So if you just glance at it, it looks like a really established fungia. And like a Monty. And I've been reaching out to a lot of locals. So I went and visited a guy I'd never met. Went and visited his tank on Monday night.
Yeah.
Came home with a couple of frags. When he comes over, I'll do the same. Went and visited another new guy that I'd never met last night. Got a couple used corals, including a couple large sun polyp zoanthid colonies. And once again, when he comes over, I'm going to bloat him up too. And that's where I'm at. That's the last couple of weeks of tanking for me.
Nice. Sounds like a big success.
It's the wild corals that make me gun shy, right? With fresh parasites. But when something is tank grown and it looks amazing, you can be pretty freaking assured it didn't get that way by carrying an infection or any kind of parasites along the way. What about
it's
you?
true, right? I'm trying to grow my fish population a little bit, and I think it was a few podcasts back we were just talking about. I don't know if we talked about it at length, but just how you can be in this hobby for 20 plus years, and you always have your eye on what's rare or new, but then you kind of look back and realize, like, crap, I've never kept, and then just insert something that's relatively common in the trade, right?
Harlequin tusk.
Right, good example.
Australian harlequin tusk.
I have never kept a Copperband Butterflyfish, so I was like, I'm gonna try one.
I joined the club 3 months ago. Yeah, nice. 20 plus years of reefing, never had one. My wife works at one of the nicer stores in town. There was this small one that was covered in lympho, and I'm just like, I'm not worried about herpes on fish. And she brought it in, and it just decimated every last polyp of Aptasia. There's no big ones, there's no small ones. He did such a good job, I actually transferred him from one coral flat to another, and then a few weeks later we got another one. So I just joined the Copperband Club recently, but you got a Copperband.
Yeah, I mean, he's in my quarantine tank for now, just trying to get him more voracious about eating before he has to, basically put up with all the boisterous fish in my big tank. So
tell me about your quarantine tank. Is it a quarantine tank or more of like a conditioning aquarium?
It is quarantine, and I know there's recently a lot of people are against prophylactic treatments and all that. I'm not too scared of ick. Flukes freak me out. Obviously velvet freaks me out, but for me it's more about the flukes and stuff that you don't see. So I do treat with Prazi, and then I have some chloroquine phosphate on hand. I still had some, so I know it's kind of hard to get, but it's a relatively easy thing to dose and handle any ectoparasites without freaking out. I find copper kind of stressful to deal with. But I mean, he's eating well. I ordered blackworms, which I haven't fiddled with since was like
live blackworms.
Yeah, you remember those things?
Yeah. I mean, I used them intermittently all my career, I do know when COVID's first hit, combined with the heat waves like last year, they weren't available at all.
Yeah.
So I just haven't had them around much.
Yeah, I heard good things about them, especially for coaxing copperbands to eat, but he has zero interest in them.
No way.
Yeah.
Butterfly fish, they can't resist.
No, it won't touch them. But this stuff, which I've always kind of kept on hand because I like feeding it, the mastic stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And this is not the kind you gotta make yourself. They're just like little pellets.
Yes, yes.
So I just mash that into a seashell, throw it on the bottom of the tank, and he goes crazy. So at least I got him eating that, but he's not interested in anything in the water column yet. So.
Oh, wow. So I have some mastic I've used for certain like finicky fish, or when I really want to get something like grazing. And I do keep it on the shelf. I don't use it like all the time. It's not a staple, but for tricky fish, when you're trying to coax them to get with the aquarium program. How long have you had your Copperband?
Since last Friday. So.
And he's already eating mastic?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. Did it take him a couple tries, or did he
No,
just
he
go
went
for it?
right for it, which shocked me. I mean, the blackworms, he was just like, nah, even though it's like a wiggly worm in the water.
That's very surprising.
Yeah. But he won't touch mysid shrimp. He won't touch
What?
Arctic pods. He won't
Your
touch...
fish is broken.
I know, and I'm a little worried
Send him
about that
back.
because I'm like, once he goes in the big tank, I can't just put like mastic in a corner just for him. All the other fish are going to go nuts for it too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm just trying to get him, fatten him up and get him ready for that. So hopefully he makes it. My Regal was like that for like months. He would just eat crap that I put in seashells. And then one day it was like a eureka moment where he was like, why don't I just eat what everybody else is eating?
Why don't I just follow all the examples all around me?
I know. So I'm hopeful. But yeah, so I'm going to give that a try.
So one thing I want to put in your ear is I have divorced from Pro.
Yeah, that stuff sucks. I use the other one, the powder one.
Oh, okay. So you're on the Prazi powder program.
Yep.
Oh, nice. So just for the listeners and viewers, Praziquantel, apparently it just has a limited shelf life in solution. And with the issues that I had with the fish tank, I really leaned harder into Prazi powder, and you have to mix it with a little bit of alcohol before you put it in the tank. And man, that was just like, it was the effect that I always looked for from Prazi Pro. I will never use Prazi Pro again.
Yeah,
if somebody gives me a big stacks of Prazi Pro, I would literally just throw them away. It doesn't seem nearly as effective. And the thing that's super interesting is it doesn't seem to affect the biology of the tank at all. It doesn't seem to irritate the fish at all. My understanding in discussions with some other more fish pathologist type aquarists is that it's apparently super gentle on the biology of the fish. And that's my new lethal weapon for quarantining. So I'm glad you're already with the program.
Yeah, the liquid stuff that I think, who makes it? Hikari, yeah. Somebody brought up that the liquid suspension or the oil that it's in is equivalent to like a heavy carbon dose. So it can starve your tank of oxygen with bacteria, whereas the powder doesn't have that problem. So I switched over to the powder as well.
As a side note, except for copper, anytime I treat antibiotics or when I use Prazi Pro or now with the Prazi powder, I just add like a ridiculous amount of aeration. Not a bunch of air stones, but like a really big pump, one air stone to just really keep those actual oxygen levels high.
Yeah, you can't go wrong. You know what's great for Q tanks is those little box filters we used to use in the freshwater days. Everybody's all about sponges. Those, like, I'm not into sponges anymore. I like those little box filters, and I just fill them up with
internal box filter.
Yeah, it's airstone driven, right?
Oh yeah, okay. I see what you're meaning.
Yeah, I mean, people used to put like filter wadding and stuff in there, but I just filling them up with like some biomedia, right? Like the rocky heavy kind. I mean, every denitrate from CCAM, you pick your poison, whatever.
Yeah, Matrix.
Matrix, yeah.
Yeah.
But those are great because you can just aerate the crap out of your tank, and all of that water is flowing through a nice biomedia. I don't know. Sponge filters obviously work great, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I just use power filters, and honestly, like my coral hospital tank has a power filter on it with just a bio wheel. There's nothing inside the filter. Like the coral is the filter. It's not putting out any waste. I kept the large frog spawn with a touch of torch and the Galaxia in there for over 3 weeks, like almost a month, with the tiniest light. No real biological filtration or mechanical filtration or chemical at all. That one didn't even have an air stone. Those corals looked amazing the last 3 weeks with their tiny little light. It was really surprising.
Nice. Yeah. So I'll get on my front. I mean, I'm traveling again next month, so I don't want to get too crazy with fish and coral and then you know, go away for a week. So October I'll probably go big. Yeah,
every time you add something, you're just
something will
like
go
your
wrong.
wife said, upsetting the harmony.
It's true, man. I know.
So
I saw some pre-quarantine fish, and I was like, "Oh, I could just add those straight up." I'm like, that's not going to work out.
It's funny. Like reefing for so long, I don't know how many times we both have probably been like, "Oh, I can get away with that," and just days later, massively regret it.
Mm-hmm.
Massively. I mean, to me, it's just like not even a thing. It's not even an option. It's not even on the table to add a fish straight to the tank.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to be the kind that could transition a fish to like what you talk about, like a conditioning, kind of like a little mini reef where he can go get fat and whatever. Or, I do have a large refugium, so I could put him in there, but I'd love to have all that. But for me, the just lightweight prophylactic treatment, like you said, with some Prazi powder, and I like the chloroquine. I just feel it gives me a little more peace of mind, and I don't think my tank is ick free. So the minute that fish enters that tank, he's gonna have to deal with something. But I know people. Some people are like, oh, if, the fish can, its immune system, whatever, can fight whatever. But to me, like a parasite that latches onto your gills, or intestinal, like. I'm not going to let my dog live with tapeworm, right? It's just, I'm not going to do it. So I'd rather just nip those things in the bud. Anyway.
So before we dive into our major topic, I just want to give a small shout out to Aquarocks. I'm giving the shout out because I wore the shirt. I'm not wearing the shirt because I planned a shout out. But as soon as you asked me about my shirt, I was like, I should show off these new magnetic structures that I really like. You can't really tell on video, but these are black. So these they come in a wide range of shapes. I pulled out the fanciest one to start, but they're black and they have just a little bit of pink accents. I'd be all right if they didn't have that. But I guess they're kind of like a resin type of material, but not like. So what I really love about these, besides their appearance, is they're lightweight. So I've had some frag racks from people made out of ceramic or kind of like a heavy resin or almost like dense silicone, and they're so heavy that you need stronger magnets to hold them up. And then I have one or two examples of a coral that's grown over the entire thing and gotten heavy enough to drag it down to the point where like the magnetic part didn't even work anymore. So I'm really I have a couple of these in tanks and I have a few out of the tank, but man, this is actually, I mean, you skip the whole like white rock or white structure turning dirty or turning green or brown and just go straight to black with some pink accents. Really nice. The only thing I would do a little bit differently is the frag plugs are all drilled with a slight backwards angle. And so, I mean, ideally that's pretty good, when you have it normally. But me, I can't do things normal. So there's certain shapes that I wanted to use upside down, but now those holes are pointed backwards. So I think in the future, I'd like to encourage them to just drill straight vertical so that basically they have a convertible coral mounting station.
Yeah, and I know it's not a sponsored thing, like you're just endorsing something you like, but I got to check those out as well because my little coral quarantine, I'm trying to redo that and not have crap on the bottom. So I was thinking about, just having magnetic frag racks and then I can just keep it,
Yeah, no, this is totally not sponsored.
And that would be a lot more attractive than like egg crate, right?
They sent me some shapes after a show earlier this year, and I asked them because like they're cool and they're lightweight, and it's one of those things because it's darker colored and because it's lighter. I just think it's going to fit very well as an add-on to like the primary aquascapes in several of my tanks.
Cool.
Yeah, man. All right, we have a fun topic lined up for this one. I hope people like it as much as we do. I've been doing my research, and I've been doing a little bit of solo therapy. Oh man, it's especially today when people are spouting off what they think they know on social media in various forms, and it's just like it's gets my blood boiling a little bit, just to see a sarcophyton being called a lobophytum. You would think that would be so easy to differentiate. So anyway, I just set that aside, and every night I've been reading some old content, some old literature. So I have a volume of the Aquarium. This is 1953,
nice.
So it's all the issues in here, and it's just delightful, polite aquarium conversation. There's not a lick of saltwater discussion in here. This all freshwater, but it's just, man, it's just like back to the old days of I don't know, just really appreciating fish. I mean, there's little profiles on little barbs and small rasboras and different paradise fish that they're just now discovering in 1953. I think there's a preview in there of the first undergravel filter, and it wasn't called an undergravel filter. It was called something like Arlo's Filtration and Booster or something. So this has been fun therapy for me, and then to supplement that and get a little bit more saltwater, going back to my 80s and 90s FAMAs, Freshwater Marine Aquarium. And this is a great issue with the narcosis on the cover, and there's great conversation and discussions in here by Rich Pyle and Dana Riddle and Bruce Carlson, and it's just delightful. It's just really delightful.
So you'll laugh at this. When I moved from one house to another, I lost my entire collection of FAMAs, going back to I think 1990. And I was devastated.
You lost them? You misplaced them, or they got wet?
No. So my theory is, because I can't, I've never been able to find them, is we would have like trash boxes, and then we'd have boxes to move, and I think that they were mistaken because they're magazines, for trash. Yeah, and I also lost a bunch of my TFH books, like the old Herbert Axelrod, crazy freshwater books. But anyway, I'm at one point I started like going eBay hunting, and I started buying up all these old FAMA magazines.
Don't tell them. Don't tell everybody. I'm still trying to get some myself.
I know.
No, but if anyone
now they're
going to
be as expensive as like corals.
No, but if you want to, here's the thing. You don't really learn new information by reading these old books, but they can tickle your brain and stimulate different ways of looking at things, and just putting yourself in their shoes back then. It really helps to put into perspective everything we've achieved and how we're doing things today. This is really informative, enriching literature, and I'm really enjoying it. I'm making sure to just read just a handful of pages every night. And the thing about FAMA, dude, this magazine right here is 250 pages. Sure, there's a lot of ads, but I'll get through like 50 pages, and I look at the ads carefully, and there's like there's like Life Reef ads in here, and I just got an email from Jeff Turchek today talking about some sumps and some skimmers, and he's down the road, so it's kind of cool to see at least one of those companies still going strong.
One of the best, the thing that if I was going to say any set of articles that triggered the reef keeping bug in me when I was already a freshwater hobbyist, obviously I'd go into the store, see saltwater stuff, see corals. Not a lot of corals, right? But I was always intrigued by that, right? But it just, I was like wet dry filters, and it just was out of my league as a kid. But in Aquarium Fish magazine, I don't know if you recall this, Delbeek wrote like a multi-part series, and every month was like a different, like he would cover lighting, he would cover filtration, And that was really the trigger point for me, because his examples were like, for example, like he had pictures of Julian's 15-gallon tank. I think his tank that he showcased was only like 30 something gallons.
Mm-hmm.
But it was like a real eye-opener of just more or less the Berlin method, but in a consumable format. Whereas in FAMA, I did, love my FAMA, and there was a lot of debates going on with the wet-dry crowd and all that. But, like, I loved how succinctly he just covered each piece of, like, if you're coming from nowhere, right, like, this is what you need to know. So
Right.
I wish I still had those. I would love to go reread those and just see, if how I romanticize those articles in my head, if they're still as great as they are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But
Well, it's also the excitement of discovery. Like right now, I think the industry is, and the hobby overall, is inundated with product offerings and design ideas and so many freaking corals. Whereas, like, in the olden days, they were lucky to find one tank at every fourth fish store they went to that actually just had saltwater, and they would have had the fish, the few corals, and like lots of invertebrates. But so you want to tell the viewers what we're discussing today?
yeah, so the more generic way, but we'll get pretty deep into it, is different kinds of, I don't even want to say reef aquariums, right? Different kinds of marine
aquariums.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The history of how things were very different at some point, depending on where you went or what, and then just the way things evolved over time.
So I think we can break that down in three ways. Maybe talk about historically, which was probably very limited. Then geographically, before everything got homogenized, and
Yep.
then kind of current. So we just want to kind of cover the different types of aquariums in the past and around the world and nowadays. Just kind of talk about some of the different characteristics and attributes of specific kinds of tanks.
Yeah.
So here's the thing: we don't have great documentation on the oldest tanks. If you want to go way back, I know Victorian tanks in late 1800s, early 1900s, they were mostly cool water, and they would just whatever they could get by the seashore, and they would have their servants go fetch some seawater from the ocean. From the sea, but I don't think we have to go back that far.
I was about to say, like, I think I remember reading that the Romans would keep moray eels in saltwater ponds or something like that, but that's pretty far back.
Probably regular eels to eat, right? I don't know. I do have a book called, I think it's called History of the Toy Fish, and that one really starts way, 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 way back and then brings it up to about the 1950s if you want more of a listen. But where do you think your image of a contemporary saltwater aquarium starts?
Late 80s. I was not a reef keeper. I was a kid, but I had my magazine subscriptions. I was a freshwater hobbyist, admiring saltwater aquariums from afar. Witnessing the transformation of the American side of the hobby by the European trends, that was that was something cool to see. And I say real time, but real time back then meant like getting next month's subscription in the mail, like a month apart, and listening to debates and editorials. And how about you?
One thing that's super funny is going through this magazine from 1994 and seeing, modern looking ads. I instinctively scan down the bottom of the ad looking for that URL, even though I know it's not there. I'm just always
exist.
I'm like, they still in business? Oh wait, this is even before websites. I think we can wind it back just a little bit more to the 60s and 70s.
Sure. I just don't have any. I was not
Me
alive.
neither. And there's very little documentation.
Yeah.
But we do know that people kept saltwater fish.
Yeah.
They tried. They had a lot of. You talk to anybody who kept a saltwater fish tank back then, and they would tell you how hard it was. but they didn't have. I mean, the best they would have was maybe undergargle filters and some canisters to go with it. Maybe, I don't think hang on the back power filters were really a thing yet.
When did the Supreme Aqua filter? Or whatever
I don't think those were safe
called?
for saltwater.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they had an external motor that was totally exposed to the air. So if it does, if it's not going to go into water, it's not going to even succumb. It's not even going to hang. But yeah, I think it's safe to say that in the 70s and leading up into the early 80s, besides a few pioneers, we're talking about bone white skeletons and yellow tangs and queen angelfish and I don't know, maybe some Florida hogfish, just whatever you get kind of close by. And, it would be a fowler without the live part. It would be fish only with DS, dead skeletons, dead coral skeletons. What's funny is those skeletons, they don't degrade, right? They just, unless they get broken up or thrown away, they make the rounds. They go around and around and around.
Well, and then there was the old, you'd have like 3 sets, and you have one in the tank that's getting algified, you have one that's bleaching, and then you have one that's in a dechlorinator, and you would cycle through them to keep your tank looking pretty and, white dead coral. I remember the steel frame tanks were a big issue for marine keepers.
Oh, yeah.
So going to the all glass silicone was like a big game changer for them.
I'll bet that helped a lot, not having your tank rusting apart. But even so, in the 1950s volume that I'm reading, there's ads in there for high quality aluminum framed stands, guaranteed not to rust in fresh water, right? So,
yeah.
But I think the most high-tech thing you could expect from the early days of saltwater aquarium keeping would be maybe the equivalent of Iwaki pumps, maybe not that brand, and some fluorescent lighting, lots of air stones, lots of salt creep. And we are absolutely not the pair to be talking about those ancient days. But I think once we start getting into the 80s, we have a lot more documentation there. So before we started this episode, I went back to an awesome time capsule of photographs from 1984 that were, I believe they were shared by Alf Nilsson, and it's
on Facebook, right? I think I saw those.
Well, Reef Builders is where we publish our stuff, and we share the stories on Facebook. No,
my bad.
Okay. Reefbuilders.com. Go to reefbuilders.com. Read Reef Builders. But no, yeah, it was Alf Nilsson showed those pictures on Facebook, and then I kind of chimed in on all of them. And what they were doing there in 1984 is what Americans would get to in about 1994. Like it was a long time coming. You don't think so?
Well, so I think around, I want to say super late 80s, maybe 1990-ish is when I remember reading, like, for example, Julian and Fama start to talk about, like, the Berlin method and defending it. You had these die-hard wet-dry guys that would write in to Reef Notes and, strongly disagree about the fact that, like, live rock is not a biological filter and you need a trickle filter and blah, blah, blah. And it was a huge, like, contentious thing. So you're probably right in the sense that mainstream adoption probably
that's
took
what
a
I mean.
while.
Of course, you had pioneers like Del Beek and Sprung and John Burleson who, just trailblazed and showed other people what was possible.
Yeah, he was bringing in all the Toonsy stuff and
Toonsy, right? Dupla.
Oh man.
Yeah. But yeah, it's incredible to see those reef tanks from '84 with Dietrich Stuber, who has the first documented Acropora grown in captivity. If I remember the story correctly, it sprouted from a piece of live rock. It wasn't even a colony that was imported. It just happened.
That story.
I have one nice piece of this staghorn, which is way more colorful than the pictures I've ever seen, and I don't know if that's an artifact of the modern lighting. But yeah, you see these tanks, and it's just big colonies of Discosoma next to sarcophytons, next to bubble corals, next to some Trachophilia, and next to some feather dusters and some chili corals. Man, they threw the whole kitchen sink at those tanks.
Well, and it wasn't just the filtration that was contentious with American reef keeping, lighting, right? I remember when they started talking about metal halides, people were very against metal halides for a while. They thought that the UV would kill the corals. There was a bit of a misunderstanding that single-ended had basically a UV filter built in, right? That outer glass, whereas double-endeds are a different story. So there were arguments even on the, everyone here was on the fluorescent bandwagon, and they thought that these halides were potentially an issue. I remember they had reef tanks with also, there was Dupla, I think, was one of the people that sold it too, was high-pressure sodium reef keeping lights.
Yeah, no.
No?
But, no, I'm just saying no to that idea.
Yeah, no, okay.
No, I know what HPS is used for here in Colorado. That is the yellowest light possible. If you want something really too close to the sun, you go to HPS.
I know you got me thinking about the years of like whether we're getting that right, because I've got what's his name's books.
Well, one thing that's safe to say is, for the longest time, we looked up and were inspired by the Northern European reef aquarium community that was centered around Germany. But I know that like Northern France, Belgium, the Netherlands, they just crushed it. They did stuff back then. Just because they were in tune with their tank, they probably didn't have the same kind of fundamental understanding of aquarium chemistry that we do today. I don't even know if they had, easy to use calcium test kits or alkalinity test kits that weren't made by Lamont and cost, $3 a pop to use. But definitely throughout the 90s, the name of the game was like, how can we be more like the Germans?
Yeah, there's a reason why it's called the Berlin method, right? Because of that reef aquarium.
Do you want to tell
club.
the readers what the Berlin method is? The readers.
Well,
you want to tell the viewers and listeners what the Berlin method is supposed to be?
I'd say before I go there, if you take like the Dutch reef keeping at that time and how it differs, one of the more common trends with the Dutch was they would still use dead coral skeletons instead of live rock. And they were very soft coral heavy. They tended to be. I mean, that's more of a stereotype, and there's obviously exception to that rule. And they were big on fluorescent lighting. Berlin method is pretty much where I think modern reef keeping has adapted from, right?
In my mind, every method is Berlin method modified
with some modifications. Yeah,
with some tweaks.
But it was
three things.
Yeah. So, okay. For me, it was obviously your live rock is your filter, right?
Lots
it's your biological filter. At the time, based on the articles I was reading, but I don't know if this is true anymore because I see plenty of these old pictures, like you mentioned. Bare bottom was highly.
That was my understanding, and you're totally right. That's a great point, because you look at these old pictures, and I'm like, those guys had sand. But somehow in the translation, when I learned the Berlin method, it was no sand.
Yeah.
And what was the third thing?
Protein skimmer.
Heavy protein skimming.
Yeah.
Now, see, we didn't even confer about this, but we remember these details the same. It was like a ton of live rock, no sand, and heavy protein skimming.
Yeah, and
I guess to a lesser degree, maybe kalkwasser.
Yeah. Although, I think the Lobecca reactor, the calcium reactor, also goes back quite a ways, right? But really what these guys like, I bring up Julian, and I don't want to take credit away from anybody else, but I grew up reading FAMA, Freshwater Marine
Reef
Aquarium.
Notes.
I guess we should mention what FAMA stands for.
I mentioned it. I said it.
Okay, cool. And then on the Aquarium Fish Magazine side, you had Charles Delbeek. So those two guys were really the ones evangelizing the Berlin method stateside. Which may seem foreign to people that grow up with the internet, where it's like, well, what do you mean? Like,
What do you mean stateside?
Well, I'm socializing with some dude in Iceland about reef keeping, and we're arguing about lights, But a good analogy, too, for me is there's like a great documentary on surfing where all these people in California were flying to Hawaii to surf like these big waves. And little did they know that, like, just north of them, there's this one dude surfing this giant wave that nobody else knew existed called Mavericks, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when these South California surfers found out about it, it was like being a mountain climber and discovering there's an Everest in your backyard, right? But that's how localized communication was, right? So if the Germans were doing something completely different in reef keeping, it wasn't like you were going on social media and going, oh, what's that, right? It's literally like somebody was writing letters, maybe on the phone, paying expensive long-distance phone bills, or traveling there and checking out reef tanks. And that's sort of what happened is they went over there. They went to these different countries. They became friends with these people. And then they started writing about it stateside. And people here are like, what? You want me to pull off my wet dry filter? Are you crazy? You know, so...
One of the funny things about the ads in this particular issue of 1993 FAMA is the stepping stone to that is protein skimmer before your biological. So all the sumps in here is a protein skimmer before the wet dry or before the bio-bale. CPRs in here or creative plastic research. But yeah, there was probably like a 5-year lag. Maybe like a 1-year lag before like the information got over, and like a 5-year lag before that information was like really widespread. But it was interesting because it also led to unique styles. So before the hyperconnectivity that we have today, Mark and myself could look at pictures of tanks, in the late 90s, early 2000s, and we can kind of pick them out. Like, oh yeah, that's a German tank, that's a Japanese tank, that's a West Coast American tank.
Yeah, they were very geographic, and you could tell just by one of it was also the equipment, right? I mean,
that was unmistakable.
Yeah, and man, you would lust after some of that equipment, right? I would lust after those. Oh, I don't want to go get ahead of ourselves, but like, let's just take the Germans, right? Like they had, H&S skimmers and Grotech stuff and
Giesman lights.
Giesman lights were
like sports cars. I mean, I as a child getting magazines from Debron Aquatics or catalogs and that fish place. Did you see these pictures of these massive shiny pendants with special ballast and built-in T5 lights or fluorescent lights and built-in tiny mood lights? But they were crazy. They were really, really beautiful. That being said, the reefers that we looked up to, almost universally, it was all DIY. They knew how to just put this stuff together, and so this ready-made stuff wasn't for the masses.
No, yeah, and even predating that, do you remember like the super tall sander skimmers? Like all these German tanks would have like a 6-foot tall. I'm probably exaggerating, probably like a 4-foot tall skimmer
I don't
next
think you
to
are.
the tank.
Yeah, but 4 foot, 5 foot, 6 foot, super heavy aeration to just blow it out. So. For most of the 90s and early 2000s, man, we just really looked to Europe for inspiration and ideas. When and how do you think the first American-style reef aquariums really materialized? What was your first notion of an American-style reef tank?
Well, so
don't say Julian again.
No. For me, America's contribution to reef keeping, also one that was highly contested in the beginning, was algal filtration, right? Refugiums and algae turf scrubbers.
Yes, that wasn't even on my radar, but yeah, the algae turf scrubber, ATS, better erroneously known today as refugiums. But yeah, the Walter 80 biological method, that's interesting. So what did
and
you...
And then the ecosystem aquarium really popularized the Calurpa trend.
Yeah.
Yep. Which, there was a bunch of Seascope articles about that, which was a free little magazine flyer thing you get at the fish store.
Mike Valletta was a cheerleader for that.
Yes.
He was on it like crazy. He's still
on it, I think, isn't he? He's still a Miracle Mud dude.
He comes and goes.
Oh, okay.
Comes and goes. But yeah, okay, so that would be a really interesting contribution to the filtration side of things. But I think still through the 90s, our reef tanks, our saltwater aquariums were either, fish tanks with lots of coral skeletons, or piles of rocks with just like, kind of a handful of corals doing okay.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the things that started to kind of Americanize it on our end, well, obviously the algae filtration, which to this day is very popular.
We did the ETS.
Well, I was about to go there. Yeah,
okay, you go ahead.
We had cheap electricity, and the Europeans didn't, right? So we would hook up a giant Iwaki skimmer or a Supreme Mag Drive 24 or whatever. And we used downdraft skimmers, Beckett skimmers. We went for horsepower, right? I mean, that was a big
that's
thing.
so American of us.
Yeah. and then the needle wheel skimmers started trickling in, right? The first one that was mainstream was the Euro Reef. Remember that? Wasn't it the first one?
Actually, I would...
No, the turbo floater.
Turbo floater, right?
Yeah.
The Aquamatic turbo floater. But that thing was around for 15 years?
Yeah.
It was around for a really long time before it was like, oh, this is how we should be doing it. I would say the first implementation of the needle wheel in a mass market would probably be the CPR Cyclone.
Oh,
CPR backpack.
Yeah.
It would, it was like a halfway step with that janky, little Rio 600, Rio 800 with a kind of perforated impeller. But yeah, the turbo floater was around for a really long time, and then Euroreef really pushed it on the equipment game.
Yeah.
I have a couple Euroreef skimmers, no pumps. I always think of myself, oh yeah, I'm gonna rebuild those one day, but all the skimmers I have are medium sized and plenty, more than I need.
I remember buying my first Euro Reef skimmer and replacing my ETS with it, and that was a big day. But what was the other brand? H&S? Does that ring a bell? H&S skimmers.
So H&S is still a German company that makes very basic.
Oh no,
designs.
sorry, yeah. No, they were another downdraft skimmer company. Marine Technical Concepts.
Marine Technical Concepts
That's
with
what I
their
was
high-speed aeration skimmer.
Yes, that's what
The HSA.
HSA. That's what I was thinking about. Okay.
The HSA. That was actually the first calcium reactor I ever used. But on the aquarium presentation side, I would say by and large most of the successful American reef tanks in the late 90s to early 2000s were fully inspired by the European tanks. It was like, what coral can we get to live, basically? And if it lives, it'll grow like crazy, right? So lots of cold corals, lots of sarcophytans, lots of shrooms. Yeah, and I would say older American tanks looked a lot like European tanks that came before them.
Yeah, I mean on the European side, I guess we forgot to mention the Jobert method that had its moment in the sun. And then on the American side, they took it and went, sugar-sized deep sandbed for a bit there, which.
Okay. I don't want to get too much into all the different methods.
No, but I would say that was a very American thing, the deep sandbed.
Yeah, they're basically
the Japanese
bastardizing.
took it over for a bit too. Like every Japanese tank I saw would have a 6-inch sandbed. But yeah.
But I guess you might have thought more about this topic on the equipment side, which I feel like is a little too easy to do. And I was thinking more about just the overall aesthetic of the tank, because it was a long time before people segregated their tanks into I have an acro tank or a shroom tank or a chalice or LPS aquarium. It was a long time before that came around.
Yeah, I think there was not really a dominant type of coral that people would keep. It would just be a mixed bag, right?
Whatever you can keep.
Right.
Whatever you can keep. And then it's funny too, because on long enough timeline, you'd be into the tank for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and if you didn't tear it down, you might end up with a field of Sinularia or cold coral or Palathella. I've seen plenty of not neglected reef tanks, just uncurated. It's like a garden that's just kind of let to grow. One thing takes over. Sometimes it's yellow polyps. A lot of times it's Sinularia. Because I think Sinularia because they can smother stuff. So I've seen plenty of examples of 4 to 6 foot fields of Sinularia. Not the green one. Not the green one. Of course, it's not the green one. It was always the brown one.
Yeah.
Just covering everything with big old mature fish.
Well, I mean, honestly, if you're talking early 2000s, late 90s, that is when the SPS craze started, right? I mean, I remember I got into SPS, what was it, like 90, 98, 99?
So if we
And I was a
roll
late
back
bloomer,
just a
right,
tiny
when it
bit,
comes to that.
Not really. I think you were right on time because we weren't really fragging. We weren't getting frags. We weren't getting stony corals. But in the mid '90s, there was definitely this this notion that SPS corals can look great one day, and the next day you come down and they're gone. They're totally gone without, RTN had a much worse sound in the late '90s and early 2000s than it does today. Even today's RTN, you're just like, all right, well, it might be progressing slowly, but the whole colony's not evaporated all of a sudden. I think so. I think there was a lot of people were very gun shy about even trying acroporas, and I think the Poeciloporas and the bird's nest and hide nose and just everything associated with them was just people were scared. They were definitely scared to try their hand at what we would consider some of the stony corals. Obviously, they always kept bubble corals and euphyllias and elegances and brain corals of different varieties, but it was the SPS corals that were like, ooh, you don't want to go there. So late '90s, we're just like, yeah, you know what? Let's go for it. So I think you and I both start dipping our toes there. That would probably be like late '90s to early 2000s when we start seeing this bifurcation of different aquarium types.
Yeah, I would agree. Because even when I'm trying to sit here and I think about the presence of acropora in aquariums before then, it was always in a mixed setting, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some
Maybe
of the
one or
tanks
two
that
pieces.
I looked up to would be like, oh crap, they got a little acropora growing in the corner there, and it'd just be a cool thing. But the move to having like an SPS dominant tank, or I don't even think that soft coral tanks were a thing back then. That was just like, it was SPS and then everything else,
Yeah. A soft coral tank. Yeah, soft coral tanks happened, right?
Yeah.
Like I said, like they would just kind of take over. But the first real differentiators when I'd say acros were the first group of corals that people felt that they had to specialize for.
They had to, right? It was a
They
dedication.
had to.
Yeah.
You had to get the brighter lights, the stronger flow, the calcium reactor. That was all about that NOP back in the day. I think that was probably the first popular, successful one here in the United States.
Yeah, that was a good unit. Had an E-Heim pump and everything.
What's funny is like today the freshwater aquarium hobby is incredibly segregated, right? The South American cichlid keepers don't talk to the Central American cichlid keepers, who don't talk to the discus people, who don't talk to the angelfish people, who don't talk to the dwarf cichlid people. We're just talking about cichlids from one continent, right? Then if you go to Africa, it's like, oh, Tanganyikans over in this corner, Malawi guys over in another corner, and then the 2 or 3 persons left over are playing with their Victorian cichlids.
I was about to say, the late Victorian guys are always the odd ducks, right?
Yeah, they are, well, because all their fish are going extinct.
Well, and they're not always, no offense to Victorian fans, but they're not as pretty.
No, absolutely not. No, I love all fish in great condition. But yeah, you see this pattern of it's like part segregation, part specialization, where once upon a time, all the reefers talk to each other. And now it's like, all right, you want to talk about zoanthids? Or do you want to talk about shrooms? Do you want to talk about monis? Do you want to talk about acros? Then even within the acros now, like, I have highlight acros and I have very low light acros, and I keep, I talk to anybody about anything, but I keep them totally separated.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point, because I think I was pretty focused on the gear, but it was more than just gear. When we talk about
The interests drove the gear, and the gear drove the interests.
Right. Yeah. And what's interesting is you see a segregation by the type of corals people are into sometimes. Sometimes people have multiple tanks dedicated to different things. Now everybody thinks a mixed reef is hard, even though that's what all we did for decades.
I would agree. I'm still kind of in that camp.
I disagree. I've never had a problem with that, but then I don't know. Maybe if you're really pushing every coral to the edge, then you're compromising somewhere. So I get it, but then there's the. You talked about the homogenization. There's definitely compartmentalized groups when it comes to types of corals, but there's less of that geographic distinction, which comes again. There's the age of communication, right? And social media has changed a lot. The fact that equipment is not as balkanized, right? Like Germans are running Ecotechs now, and everything's available everywhere. So you see.
I mean, let's just get this out of the way. Today, the best reef aquarium equipment is American.
Yeah, where it used to be European.
Absolutely. It totally inverted.
And that's not an attack on European equipment. I still think, I'm a huge fan of Tunzi, right? I'm a huge fan of a lot of those.
Tunzi is one of those few exceptions of a company that's really kept up with the time. They make their own innovations. They have their fans and their markets. But by and large, all the major LED light manufacturers, are American. I'm not taking away from the GHL Mitris or...
Well, and you're talking about lights, but what about skimmers and pumps? Because a lot of that stuff is derived out of Asia now, and it's good. Yeah,
okay, all right. Let me roll it back just a little bit. Seachay makes some awesome pumps, and Ultra Reef makes some awesome skimmers. But a lot of the equipment, American, I feel that the scene, it's almost like pop culture, right? Because everything is so connected now, America has exported so much pop culture that it's influenced and been integrated with a lot of different cultures around the world. And I feel like it's kind of like the same thing. Aquarium culture has been exported from America and has a lot of influence on everybody else. But I'll give it to Tunzi and Seachay, because they've just been making quality stuff and kind of marching to the beat of their own drum for a long time. Granted, it took a while for both of those companies to kind of finally get with the times with controllable pumps and wireless programming.
But what about some of the stuff that CoralView brings in and stuff like the gyre pumps and
okay, yes, sure, but the MaxSpec was heavily influenced by some water flow articles back in the mid 2000s, so you could argue that that was exported. All right, I'm not trying to say that only America has it. Let's get back to I'm going to get in trouble here.
But
let's get back to the different types of tanks.
I think what I'm running into is that to me, it would be it was always fun back in the day to click on somebody's little post on a forum or something, or read an article about somebody's aquarium and see how they do things differently. And that's still true to an extent, but a much lesser extent, right? You click on a tank and it's like, oh, it's running radions. Oh, I know that skimmer. Oh, I know that's a Red Sea tank. And then, okay, you're really into SPS, right? And there's less DIY, there's less geographic kind of things cooking in a pot by itself, right? Like the Germans are
right.
The Germans are over here doing some weird stuff. Like, what the hell are they doing? It's like it's all the same now, and it's again, maybe this is my get off my long comment for the podcast.
We have to
but
have
it's
one
like
every episode.
At least one. But yeah, it's all kind of the same now. You get on Instagram and, it's, I get excited when somebody plops a mangrove in. I'm like, oh, that's different, But that's about as far as we get,
My mangrove grove is like full.
Is it?
It's super thick. Like a couple of the trees are starting to crack, like, the top of the tank.
Oh,
and
snap.
I'm going to have to look at getting some new lights to light them up especially. But yeah, I think we might have skimmed over to the Acropore dominated tanks of the 2010s, and people got into zoanthids and they got more into the lures and LPS. But yeah, now it's not uncommon to see a tank that almost has some Dutch freshwater aquarium inspiration, where and this is, I totally adhere to this. Euphyllias in one corner, micromucilords in another corner, maybe chalices, in a shaded, protected areas, and all the highlight stuff on top. I'm so down with that. But But yeah, now you see it over and over again, and I would say what typifies the current state of things is collectoritis. People acquire things and they have a lot of corals, and I would say maybe like 1 in 20 tanks has really thriving corals. Having a coral and kind of growing it is not the same as stimulating it to blossom.
Well, I think we said it in like our last podcast that some of the coolest tanks I've seen have been in like a doctor's office, because the corals just grow buck wild, and there's a guy that shows up once a week, you know. But I'm
actually really highly motivated to go visit a lot of aquarium maintenance service tanks, because they're not, once a tank is established, they're not adding more than like 6 corals a year to that tank. Maybe 12 if it's a giant tank.
Could be like a time capsule, you know.
Yeah,
reef keeping lineage.
Go find some old corals that are just kind of living and growing and not being loved or appreciated or worshipped like they should be. Some doctor's office or some, random office. Did I tell you I went to Spyderco recently? Spyderco is a knife company.
Yeah.
Very popular with knife enthusiasts. Their factory's here in Golden, but they have a retail outlet. They have like a 75-gallon tank, full reef, totally set up. And as soon as I saw it, I knew who set it up, because I know his style and I know like the equipment he uses. But it had 2 of their hyper rust resistant knives in the aquascape. They had been in there for 3 years, and not even a hint of pitting. But yeah, there was 20, 25 corals in there, all huge and looking amazing. The only reason I didn't snap a photo is because I didn't have my yellow orange filters, because it's got, I think, 2 Radion XR15 Gen 4s on it. But yeah, I think, kind of winding it down, we're seeing...
Well, so I have 2 questions for you, because
yes.
I feel like you're an expert now on this more than I am. One, radiums, the blue spectrum, right? Was that an American thing? Because the first person I heard to start really going with blue bulbs was Steve Tyree back in the day. So was that... did that originate stateside before it went to Europe, or the European guys mostly just 10K?
I don't think I can comment on that, because... like we said, it was so insulated. Like, who's to know how many people in Europe saw those bulbs and loved them? Clearly, the bluer lighting was championed by a succession of different people that became increasingly bluer.
Right.
But nowadays, I see tanks inspired by Instagram being built and designed to succeed on Instagram. And I think there's one example of a guy, it's like Coral Fish Zoo or something, or Fish Coral Zoo, amazing looking aquarium, absolutely technically infeasible, right? It's like, yes, you can put those corals next to each other for about 2 weeks. When you got a blasto next to an acro, next to a gorgonian, next to a chalice, yeah, you can put together this collage of living corals that looks freaking crazy visually on Instagram. But there's a reason that his first attempt was up for 3 or 4 months, or maybe a year, and then he took it down and did another one. But that's not something to aspire to. I don't know. On the one hand, it's cool that people are appreciating a wider range of aquarium coral groups. But on the other hand, it's like, I want to see some big 2-handed corals. Mm-hmm. I want to see a 4-foot tank with 10 corals. 10 corals in it. Because you're missing so much. The coral is a multi-dimensional animal. You have the frag, you have a small colony, and it's not until things get a foot across, or at least some appreciable size, that you really start to see the distinguishing characteristics of a Acropora prostrata from an Acropora millipora. You cannot tell apart the frags. You cannot tell them apart until they're 5 inches across, and you're like, oh, that's a prostrata, that's a millipora, that's a spathulata.
Well,
so,
frags
we're missing.
Used to be the downer part of reef keeping is crap, I gotta grow this frag out, I gotta be patient. And now it's there's tanks that are just frags. They're dedicated to frags. They're the thing now. the eventual thing the coral becomes is less of a thing. The other thing I think is that there's still this operating in absolutes, right? It's like, oh, I have a fish only with live rock. I have a reef tank. And what I don't understand, and I've seen some people do it, and it's awesome, is why not kind of skirt the edge, right? Go for fish that are risky with corals and then invest in corals that are cheap, soft corals. They're noxious, things that fish don't want to eat. Throw a bunch of green Sinularia all over the tank, put in some cool butterfly fish, and have a cool tank, right? Like there seems to be like this operating in like absolutes and not realizing there's like some middle ground. But the other question I had for you is, you've traveled way more. You've seen more international reef tanks than I have in recent years. Do you still see some differences or something unique that maybe is a result of culture or just I don't know? Like you've written about reefs in Dubai. You've been to Asia, Australia. I've always been curious. Like, what are your observations about how these different countries, do they have different trends, or
this is not the last word on this topic, right? This is probably not the last time we'll talk about it. But I would say that the Europeans, they share a lot of corals, just like us. So every tank's going to have something like a green slimer and a Milka stylo. I think Milka stylo is like totally supplanted the green slimer as the beginner SPS. So I would say the Europeans are still growing larger corals. They have few corals and they're larger. Americans, a lot of collecting. They're going to have, they're always going to have frag racks on the front glass, on the side glass, on the back glass, in the sump. They got to have the frags, got to have them everywhere. It's just like acquire. And that's probably where you see the least amount of development and maturity in the coral colonies is in the American scene, because everybody's still so busy getting this piece and getting that piece. And it's kind of a function of capitalism. Let's see. In Australia, man, they don't even know how good they have it, man. They don't really have frags so much as they can buy a colony of nice, fresh, wild Great Barrier Reef stuff for, $30 to $50 Australian dollars. I don't think I've ever seen a coral in Australia besides Goalies that was over $100. Although, everything is coming up with the times. And in Asia, they're really, man, they want their tank to look like super striking on day one. So I think they are probably most to credit for like these really creative aquascapes, which on the one hand are really interesting, but also takes away and reduces the room for corals to grow. Yeah, is that a good answer?
Yeah, I mean,
one thing I would say is in Italy, God, I think some of the best tanks, I know I've talked to a few other people, some of the best tanks I've ever seen were in Italy, because they would have one tank, and I just think it's beyond culture. It's like between their genetics and their culture, the eye for design and aesthetics is just part of being Italian. The Italian reef tanks impressed me the most. Just the presentation, the aquascape, the size of the corals. Yeah. Interesting. those tanks were freaking awesome. I would go back to Italy to go see, like, tour some home reef tanks a lot more.
Yeah, the only thing I've seen or noticed from afar is like with the Japanese SPS tanks, it's much more maricultured size colonies that they fill up the tank with, versus starting with little half-inch frags. And to your argument about the frag collection thing, I think the tough part about that is that it doesn't show your chops, right? Let's say I was into orchids, and I just, every time the orchid died, I just put a new orchid up, and I was like, I really like orchids, right? And I take pictures of it. Whereas I think when you grow these things out and you see the maturation of a reef, that's the flex, right? Like that's showing like, hey, I've figured this hobby out and I'm enjoying it and I know how to take care of these corals properly. Whereas if you just show me 3 billion frags, I'm wondering, one, where all these corals are going to grow into, and two, usually you don't see something 3 years later that looks great and is grown in.
The problem with the gram and the socials and the tubes, doesn't matter how you got there.
Yeah.
You can say it after the fact, but if your thumbnail is super eye catchy, or your photo is like just really flattering, people are not even going to read the description. There's like, oh my god, that's amazing. And sometimes you might even have some Photoshop, like literally pieced together aquascapes, so people are going to be like loving it and not realizing that. But it's super easy to point the finger and wag the finger at things that we don't agree with. But one thing that it's really important to take in is that we have the luxury that the aquarium hobby is so popular now and so successful that it has branched off in every single direction, right? It would be no fun if everybody was held to like a militant standard, right? And a broken clock was right 2 times a day or something, right? So if people keep throwing stuff against the wall, eventually you're like, oh, hey, that's really freaking awesome. Even though they didn't realize how unique it is what they're doing. Certain stuff like, what do they call it? The negative space aquascape, is that what's called? NSA? Is that?
Yes.
You've seen that around, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just like, oh yeah, I did a reef tank with just a coral like 10 years ago. Is that negative enough for you? But the NSA stuff, the floating reefscape is super cool. So with more experimentation, there is a lot more inspiration. Some of it is kind of silly, and some of it is maybe misplaced and just kind of vying for attention. And other stuff, people put a lot of work into it, and they have a winner. They have a winning recipe, a winning strategy. So.
There's always transitions, and sometimes the transition period isn't great, but something good comes out of it, right? So I'm kind of curious to see, get in the time machine and what does this hobby look like in 10 years? And I know we bounced around a lot because we tend to do that when we get, on a subject, and we probably should have covered like leech and eng from Indonesia. We probably should have talked a bit more about Japanese tanks and how they were kind of different when we started to see pictures of those things. But in the end, that's kind of what's fun about, I think, us talking about it, is we'll go down a rabbit hole and start talking about it, right?
I think the most important thing is that we have the luxury of dissecting all these different branches of the reef aquarium tree, and it'll be super interesting to see which branches continue growing, which ones kind of are offshoots that aren't going to work. Some examples of different types of tanks that had small moments would be like non-photosynthetic coral tanks, which I've done a couple times, and in my book, this just is not a reef tank. It's a totally different animal because everything about it is different. Low light, high flow, tons of feeding. But you don't want the kind of fish that are going to steal the food from your NPS corals, et cetera, et cetera. So we have that luxury of being able to criticize. It could totally be a very different situation where the hobby was just like struggling and there was one way to do it. But I think, you and I being middle-aged reefers, we're always going to be most impressed with grown-out tanks. Like, I don't even care if you grow it from a frag or from a colony, if it's big and large and luscious and you had it for a long time and kept it alive. That's always going to resonate with me more than a colorful fruit stand of very contrasting colors. Whereas contemporary reefers who've been in it for the last 5 or 10 years, they might be more impressed with, a lot of clash of colors and shapes and textures. And, to each his own, I guess.
Yeah. I think there's room for everything and everybody, right? I love what the nano people are doing. I love that nano reef forums have biotope subforums, right? I'm like, yeah, all right, cool, that's really neat.
Let's go.
Yeah, that's a their finite amount of space pushes their creativity, right? So, yeah, it's come a long way, right? I think maybe that's the point of all this, is that there was a time where we didn't know how to keep stuff alive. There was a time where we didn't know how to keep water chemistry, right? We were arguing about nitrate factories and you know, whether a wet dry was needed to keep everything alive. And denitrification was like this mystical thing that, like, at one point, like, people questioned whether it was possible in a tank, you know. We've come a long way where we're not debating. Now people are like debating lights, but at the end of the day, I think every light that your favorite reef retailer sells will grow you coral very colorful. Whereas there was a time
on
where
the market that won't.
Right. But there was a time, right? Like, there was a time where you had to wire
like,
ballast together and figure it out.
That's not gonna work. But yeah, there's the fun part about this session of reef therapy for you and me is that, you know, late '90s, having a discussion about different types of tanks would have been a non-starter. Like, what do you mean different types of tanks? I keep a reef tank. I keep whatever will grow in it. There wasn't a preference. There was no direction. And it's cool to see the experimentation. I do want to push back a little bit on the tanks that are a little bit heavily inspired by how many likes they get on Instagram versus what they simply just visually, like to see from day to day.
Well, and it makes sense from that perspective of, hey, I'm going to grow this tank out for 3 years and then I'll post it on Instagram. Like, I guess that doesn't really work with that culture, right? So
yes. Well, I think we've touched on this before, but I think the old salts have been doing it for a long time. They look at the reef tank every day and they don't, to them, it's just like, it's just a decent reef tank. The thing I'll tell you, though, is like every one of my reef tanks, if I had never seen them before, I would lose my mind at every single one of them. But because I see them every day for 2 or 3 years, the mangrove tank, soft coral, Euphilia, LPS tank, the flagship reef, the Red Sea tank, the Australian-inspired Kate Aquarium, any one of those, if I just like stumbled upon it, I would be like, oh my God, that is amazing. But I see them all the time. So I think it's probably the same, very similar for, these, basically, like the maintenance guys. They've been doing that same tank for 5-10 years. It's like, oh yeah, it looks normal. But when you reset your baseline and you look at it with fresh eyes, you're like, oh my God, you've achieved something amazing.
Yeah, that's very true.
One thing I will say too is having all these specialists, Justin Zoanthids, Justin Montes, Justin LPS, Justin Chalice, Justin different groups of acros, is what has led us to this current future where there's so many varieties of Monoporus, so many varieties of Zoanthids, you can't even tell them apart, so many varieties of just tenuous. And so that is one of probably the best part about having all these specialists and all these people, looking for the next greatest thing. In the moment, it's like kind of painful to watch when people are kind of reaching to create a method or to name a coral. But the best stuff really does, remain standing at the end of the day. And corals like the jack-o'-lantern Leptoceras, that wasn't like Leptoceras wasn't even on the map, right? Like 10 years ago. And now look how many corals, strains of just Leptoceras / Lithophyllon are available for purely encrusting purposes, right? We didn't even keep any encrusting corals that weren't green star polyps back in the day. There was nothing encrusting. But now we have so much variety of all these different corals. It is definitely the best time to be a reef aquarist. And I don't want to give people the impression that we're sitting here like nagging or wagging our finger too much. But
I just would like, it's more of a wish list of what I would like to see. And it's not that I want to go back in time, but I'd like to see more thematic reef keeping, right? Like I brought up biotopes, but you don't even have to go there. I remember somebody said, hey, I'm going to set up, maybe it was you, a Montipora focused aquarium, right? I'm like, well, that's kind of cool. That's kind of different, right?
It's going.
That's the kind of stuff that I think is interesting. And some of those guys obviously are already doing that, right? If they're hyper-focused on zoanthids or mushrooms or whatever. But I just would like that. That's the stuff that I find interesting, right? Because the equipment's all the same. So it's not like how you reef keep it is interesting, because it's like we're all kind of doing the same thing now. Okay, you dose, I use a calcium reactor, or vice versa. But, I mean, we all use the same equipment now, for the most part. Or you and I may run different lights, but your lights are not something I've never seen before. So for me, it's and now the tanks, we've talked about that. The tanks are the same, right? Everybody's got like if everybody has a Red Sea tank or
has a high clarity rimless you know,
The plumbing's ready. The sump's already put together
the same.
for you. So the differentiators
see bigger
has to
corals.
be the. I agree. I would love to see mature corals because man, there is nothing like a healthy mature coral. But I
A
also just
big
would like to
coral.
see that expression within go further, right? If everybody does
Yeah.
NSA, it's not that cool anymore. If every tank has
No.
it, right? So.
That's
Anyway.
a fair point. That's a fair point. I guess that is the natural cycle of things. As these fads become ubiquitous, then they're not novel, and then it's on to the next thing. So, all right. I
I think we've beaten this one to death.
I think we did a good, fun job. It was kind of cool to zig and zag and talk
Yeah.
about the different types of tanks and equipment geographically, temporally, and currently. So, good stuff, man. Good stuff. Well, do you have any closing thoughts, Mark?
No, I mean, I love our tangents. I do, hope people that are new to reef keeping look up things like look up the history a bit, like the Berlin method, or even we didn't talk about Lee Chin, from Indonesia, who was again, he was like the Mavericks wave surfer guy that nobody knew about, right? He had an airstone and live rock and was growing coral when everybody was like, you can't keep coral, and
That's not possible. And it was like 30 years later, and like, oh, he might have been onto something.
yeah, that's interesting. Trust me, if you go Google that stuff, go read about that stuff, it'll make you appreciate your tank and the hobby and why you have a skimmer and why am I doing this? Why am I doing that? Like it all it didn't just happen, right? It's like it was a sense of discovery and evolution, and you'll appreciate it more, I think. So
Yeah, absolutely. So you tell them to Google it, and my parting word is go to eBay and type in, I don't know, vintage aquarium magazine.
oh yeah,
And just
get
pick
some
up
from
a
the
couple
90s
issues
and
from
stuff.
the 80s or early 90s. And I mean, it'll cost you, I don't know, 5, 10, 15, 20 bucks shipped to get, some older FAMAs. And just take a look inside and just see what they're selling and what they're talking about. And I think it will instill such a greater sense of appreciation for how slick our equipment has become, how much more the performance has increased and the diversity of corals and fish is through the roof. So yeah, it's a good time to be a reefer.
It is. It's a really good time.
All right, Mark. Well, thanks for spearheading this latest session of Reef Therapy, and we'll get at it on the next session.
All right, man. It was good to chat again. And for those of you who are listening on various podcasts, make sure you like it and rate it. And if you catch us on YouTube, I guess what do they say? Hit that like button.
Smash
Subscribe.
that like button.
Smash that like button.
What is it? Thumbs up if you liked it. Subs if you loved it.
Oh, and
I
I promised my daughter I would say this. It's my daughter's birthday today, so happy birthday, Elise.
Happy birthday, Elise. All right, thanks everyone. We'll catch you guys on the next one.
Thanks.